They called him Koba, a name that once belonged to a Georgian folk hero, a symbol of vengeance and defiance. But in 1914, buried deep in the Siberian tundra, Koba was no legend. He was a man, a 35-year-old exile, thin, charismatic, unpredictable. He had robbed banks, ordered executions, dodged death, and now, in a frozen village near the Arctic Circle, he met a 13-year-old girl, and everything changed. This isn't propaganda. It's not rumor or internet myth. It comes from the sealed archives of the Soviet secret police and from one of the world's most respected historians, Simon Sebag Montefiore. But there's something about this story that most people missed, a detail so buried, so strategically hidden, that even Khrushchev didn't dare say it out loud. I'll return to that. What you're about to hear is not just a disturbing chapter in Stalin's private life. It may be the key to understanding how power is constructed, not in public speeches or party congresses, but in silence, fear, and what gets erased from history. Because before the purges, before the portraits, before the myth of the Man of Steel, there was a village, there was a girl, and there was a silence so profound it outlived them all. And that's why we do what we do. This channel is built on bringing these buried stories back to light, with real sources, serious analysis, and no shortcuts. We're close to hitting a major milestone, and every subscription gets us there. If you believe history deserves to be told unfiltered, and that silence isn't the end of a story, it's just the part we haven't uncovered yet, then subscribe now, because what comes next changes everything. In the far northern reaches of the Russian Empire, where maps fade into snow and silence, there was a place so isolated that even punishment felt like disappearance. It was called Kureika, a village in name only, with fewer than 70 souls, no roads, no oversight, and no memory. This is where the Tsarist regime sent the men it wanted forgotten. And this is where Stalin began crafting the myth of his invincibility, not with speeches or slogans, but through the quiet conquest of a place with no witnesses. By the winter of 1914, Yosef Jugashvili had already lived a life that defied statistics. Born in Georgia, raised in poverty, expelled from seminary, hunted by the police, he had reinvented himself as Koba, a revolutionary alias soaked in blood and folklore. He had helped plan armed robberies, sanctioned kidnappings, and operated within the Bolshevik underworld with a ruthless pragmatism masked by poetry and charm. He was dangerous not because of what he said, but because of what he could convince others not to say. Kureika became his domain by default. The village, frozen near the Arctic Circle, offered no resistance. There were no priests, no newspapers, no party officials, just wooden huts, widows, exiles, and orphans. In this vacuum of structure, Stalin stood out, not as an outcast, but as a leader. He was the only man fluent in both Russian and Georgian. He quoted literature, hosted meetings, and captivated locals with his strange blend of intellect and intimidation. Even in exile, he knew how to control a room, especially when that room had no exits. It was in this environment, detached from law, memory, and surveillance, that Stalin encountered the Perepygin family. They were raising several orphans, among them a quiet 13-year-old girl named Lidia. What followed wasn't recorded in speeches or journals. It was written in silence, in the absence of files, the missing photographs, the rumors that outlived everyone but were never printed. And yet, the traces remain. You just have to know where to look. But there's something in that first encounter, something small, almost imperceptible. that reframes everything that came after. I'll come back to that. She didn't speak much. In fact, most who remembered her later described Lidia as quiet, obedient, and barely present in a room. She had no surname of her own, only the borrowed identity of the family that took her in. 13 years old, orphaned, raised by the Perepygins in the far north, she belonged to no institution, no narrative, no future. And perhaps that's precisely why she became so vulnerable. In Kureika, anonymity was more than survival. It was currency, and she had none. Lidia lived in a house of 7 children, none biologically hers. Food was scarce. Heat was a luxury. There were no teachers, no doctors, no laws worth quoting. What passed for order came from memory, custom, and fear. Into this vacuum walked a man 22 years older, already infamous in underground revolutionary circles, already fluent in manipulation. Stalin didn't announce himself with force. He didn't have to. He brought books, warmth, and charm, and, more dangerously, the attention no one else had ever offered her. At first, he visited often. Then he stayed. Local hunters and farmers began to notice. One of them, Fyodor Tarasev, recalled years later that Stalin was seen entering the Perepygin home late at night, often unannounced, always unchallenged. No one in the village dared question him openly, but one man eventually did, and paid for it with blood. Still, the full nature of their relationship remained a whisper. Nothing documented, nothing said aloud, until the first pregnancy. Lidia was a child. Stalin was not. The imbalance wasn't just social, it was structural. In a village ruled by silence, even a wounded girl had nowhere to turn. Stalin reportedly promised marriage to avoid scandal, but the child didn't survive. And that promise vanished with the snow. But this wasn't the end of their connection. Not yet. Because it's what happened after the second pregnancy, and what Stalin did not do, that reveals a far deeper strategy. And it's in that silence, not in any speech, that we begin to see the architecture of power he would later build. I'll return to this point soon. Stalin understood something about human dynamics that no manifesto could teach. In isolated places, power isn't granted. It's taken. In Kureika, there was no state, no press, no rival authority. Influence flowed not from orders, but from presence. And Stalin made himself present in Lidia's life with unsettling consistency. He became a fixture at the Perepygin home, attending meals, joining hunts, embedding himself in their rhythm until his presence no longer raised questions, only murmurs. But not everyone was silent. Ivan Lalitin, a local guard and former prison acquaintance of Stalin, grew suspicious. He watched, waited, then acted. One night, Lalitin stormed into the Perepygin house, saber in hand. A fight broke out. Stalin was slashed across the neck, a wound that never quite healed. But the scar left behind wasn't just physical. It marked a moment when someone dared to challenge the man who would later rule an empire, and failed. After that, no one else tried. It was around this time that Lidia became pregnant again. She gave birth to a son, Alexander. Stalin never acknowledged the child. Not then, not later, not ever. He left Kureika without notice, without letters, without even a rumor of return. But this absence wasn't passive. It was intentional. It was the first sign of a pattern Stalin would repeat across his rule. The surgical erasure of any trace that didn't serve the myth. Years later, as Montefiore combed through KGB archives, he found the echoes. Testimonies, names, locations, all pointing back to Lidia. But what Stalin did next, or rather, what he allowed the system to do in his place, reveals a far deeper calculus. A decision not just to abandon, but to erase. And within that erasure was the seed of something even darker. I'll return to that. 3 years after Stalin's death, in the tense aftermath of 1953, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. Nikita Khrushchev was preparing a reckoning, the now infamous secret speech that would denounce Stalin's purges and cult of personality. But before he spoke publicly, the party needed something far more dangerous: internal proof. Quietly, General Ivan Serov, head of the KGB, was ordered to investigate Stalin's private life. The result was sealed under a chilling title: Personal Dossier No. 1. This file was not hearsay. It contained Politburo memos, testimonies from guards and villagers, and cross-referenced internal reports. Among its most damning entries was the name Lidia Perepygina. The document stated in precise terms that Stalin had engaged in a sexual relationship with a minor while in exile, had fathered a child, and had deliberately abandoned both mother and son without acknowledgement. No euphemisms, no revisionist framing, just cold documentation. But that section never made it into Khrushchev's final speech. Too volatile, too personal. The risk wasn't just reputational, it was structural. To admit Stalin's private abuses would be to unravel the carefully curated myth of the revolutionary father figure. So the section was redacted, not erased, but hidden. The file was archived deep within party records, then later transferred to the KGB vaults. Forgotten, but not destroyed. Decades passed. Then, after the Soviet collapse, historian Simon Sebag Montefiore gained limited access to these archives. What he found confirmed the whispers, but added something far more disturbing: coherence. Every location matched, every name aligned. Lalatin, Tarasiv, the Perepygins, even the geography of the house in Kureika. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a pattern. And then came a voice from the silence. Alexander, Lydia's surviving son, reached out to Montefiore. He had grown up with vague rumors that his father was an important man, a dangerous man. Sayti, when he read young Stalin, he recognized the world it described. And with a single sentence, he changed the story. Now I know who he was. But what shocked Montefiore most wasn't the brutality of the past. It was the clarity with which it had been recorded, and the choice to bury it anyway. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was policy. And that policy would become the blueprint for something much larger. I'll show you what that was. When Stalin left Kureika, he left no trace. No letters. No photographs, no signatures. The village, the girl, the child, all disappeared from the official record. This wasn't shame. It wasn't indifference. It was design. Stalin understood better than anyone that power wasn't just about control over territory or ideology. It was about controlling memory. And in the new Soviet order he was helping to build, there was no place for weakness, sentiment, or scandal. The timing was precise. As Stalin returned south and reinserted himself into the Bolshevik network, he began rising quickly. He aligned with Lenin, with Dzerzhinsky, with Molotov. He moved through the ranks not by idealism, but by efficiency. Every tie to Kureika became a liability. Lidia was forgotten. Alexander, her son, grew up nameless. No support, no recognition, only the silent knowledge of villagers who knew better than to speak. This wasn't an isolated erasure. It was part of a system Stalin perfected over decades, a method of historical redaction that mirrored the regime's approach to opposition, dissent, and even former allies. When someone fell out of favor, Their image vanished from photos. Their names disappeared from records. Entire family trees were clipped from public archives. In Stalin's USSR, history wasn't a record, it was a weapon. And Kureika was the prototype. Long before the purges, before the gulags, before the rewriting of entire textbooks, Stalin rehearsed his methods in a frozen village. The silence he left behind wasn't accidental. It was a calculated preview of how he would later rule an empire. He didn't need a title to exert absolute control. He only needed fear, distance, and the certainty that no one would speak. But even silence has an echo. And what Stalin tried to erase left fragments too stubborn to die. The real question is why this mattered so much, and what it reveals about the machinery of totalitarian power. I'll return to that. It's tempting to view the story of Lidia Perepygina as a dark anomaly, a moral failing, a private disgrace. But that framing misses the deeper mechanism at work. What happened in Kureika was not just personal, it was structural. It revealed how Stalin operated long before the world knew his name, not as a statesman, but as a manipulator of silence, proximity, and fear. He didn't need official power to dominate. He only needed a space without rules. Stalin's relationship with Lidia was not an isolated abuse. It was a reflection of how he tested the boundaries of influence in a microcosm devoid of oversight. In a village with no law, he created his own. In a house with no witness, he shaped fate. The silence wasn't an after effect. It was the environment he required to operate. The same environment he later imposed on an entire country. Alexander, Lydia's second son, lived his entire life in that silence. The village knew, but no one spoke. It wasn't just fear of reprisal. It was the internalization of a broader truth, that some names carried consequences, and some origins were best left unknown. For decades, Alexander wandered in that fog, until the day he read a book and recognized his own life inside it. But the final irony is this: the story of Lidia was never completely buried. It simply waited, in testimonies, in marginal notes, in sealed files and whispered memories. And when it resurfaced, it didn't just stain Stalin's reputation. It exposed the architecture of how power protects itself, not by denying violence, but by normalizing its disappearance. Because empires aren't judged solely by what they build, they are also defined by what they erase. And in Kureika, under the weight of snow and silence, the foundations of that erasure were already in place. What remains now is the question of why it took so long for anyone to listen, and why that silence still matters. I'll close with that. Stalin's rise is often measured in battles won, purges executed, or treaties signed. But perhaps that's misleading. Because long before the world feared his name, long before the party gave him titles, he had already learned how to dominate through calculated silence, selective memory, and the deliberate removal of inconvenient truths. What happened in Kureika wasn't an exception to his legacy. It was the foundation of it. Lidia Perepygina died without public recognition. Her son lived without a surname. The village that knew their story remained quiet, not just out of fear, but because it had been trained to see silence as survival. And yet, the erasure was never perfect. Pieces remained. Names in a sealed file, an old man's scar, a child's vague memory of absence. And when the Soviet Union fell, that silence cracked just enough for the truth to resurface. This isn't just the story of a dictator's hidden past. It's a reminder that authoritarian power often begins not with violence, but with forgotten victims, people removed not by force, but by omission. Lydia's life was deemed too inconvenient for the myth Stalin needed. so she was deleted. But history, like memory, resists deletion. And sometimes, all it takes is one thread to unravel the illusion. So if this story resonated with you, if it made you see the machinery of power through a new lens, then you already understand why this channel exists. We're close to reaching an important milestone, and every new subscriber makes this work possible. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive, the ones that were almost lost. And in return, you gain something too, the ability to see history as it truly is, not clean, not safe, but real. Because before the parades, before the slogans, before the portraits on every wall, there was a village, a girl, and a silence. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the empire really began.